Hey guys, Brian Schultz here with Cape Falcon Kayak with an update and a trip report about the Kayak Catamaran sailing system that I've been working on for quite a while now. Now, if you're not familiar with this whole concept, basically the catamaran system is something that grew organically out of a self-rescue system that I was developing when I was prototyping my nesting canoes. And once I had that in place, I realized it would be pretty effortless to set up a catamaran that could be really easily assembled and disassembled so you could quickly return back to solo canoe mode. And so at the same time, I was also developing these little pop-up sails that are super quick and easy to deploy so you can catch a quick downwind breeze or a crosswind breeze, but it doesn't interfere with just normal canoe paddling mode when you don't want to use it. And when you combine both those things together, you get the canoe sailing catamaran system. So that's something that has been in consistent development for the last 4 years. It's already part of my skin-on-frame canoe building system. But the entire time that I've been working on that, I was really eager to try to apply it to my kayak building system as well, because canoes, by their very nature, can only have so much rough water ability. And I realized that if I could apply this same system to my kayaks, I could potentially cruise in much rougher conditions, which would open up different places I'd be able to visit using this system. So that's what I've been working on this year. I started the year by developing a brand new flat deck version for both of my modern kayaks, specifically with this catamaran functionality in mind. I realized later that that's not actually necessary, so now I have instructions in the building course for how to apply the catamaran system to both the flat deck version and the ridge deck version, both of which have advantages and disadvantages. Now after that, I made a skin-on-frame specific rudder installation course because even though I'm not a big fan of rudders in general, when you start getting sails involved, it does give you a lot more control and it just makes the whole thing a lot easier to use. So you don't absolutely need a rudder to be able to use this system. You can steer this pretty effectively with a canoe paddle, but it is nice to have if you're willing to put in the time to do the installation. And so, final thing I've been working on here is just really refining the sail, which I've got a head start on because I've been using a similar sail in my canoes for the last 4 years. But I really wanted to bring the whole thing up to a new level of quality and performance for the kayak sailing system, both to be able to squeeze as much performance as possible out of these sails, but also just to make sure that the whole thing is strong and functions really well so we're not going to have any unexpected failures or any surprises out on the water. And so that kind of brings me to the present moment. We've had this thing out a couple times unloaded. It is a lot stiffer than I expected it to be. It seems to handle rough water and big waves pretty easily. So next step was to load this thing down with gear and really push it to its limits in some bigger winds and some heavier currents, which we definitely did over this last week. So for a testing ground for this, we decided to do a 3-day trip between the Bonneville Dam and the Dalles Dam in the Columbia River Gorge. And if you're not familiar with Oregon, that is an extremely windy stretch of river. That's where everybody goes to go windsurfing and kiteboarding. And this time of year, there's actually quite a bit of current still coming down the Columbia. And anytime you've got that much current going against that much wind, it stacks up some pretty steep seas. And that combined with the fact that these boats were loaded down just made this kind of a perfect scenario to really put a lot of stress on this entire system to see if there was going to be any unexpected surprises. So we launched from Cascade Locks. It was pretty uneventful, a little bit frustrating to pack the flat-decked version of my modern kayaks. I've talked about that extensively in other videos, so I'm not going to talk about it anymore here. But if you're thinking about building a flat-decked version of one of my kayaks, just keep in mind that is an issue. And if you don't want to deal with that, you should definitely be building our ridged-decked versions, which are otherwise identical, but just camp and pack a whole lot easier because that's what they were designed to do. So anyways, launched into about 3 miles per hour of current with about 12 miles per hour of wind behind us. It was really kind of fun sailing up the little channel right there in the middle of Cascade Locks and under the bridge. Got out into a little bit more open water. The whole system performed pretty much exactly like I was hoping it would. Catamaran system was fine, sails were fine. Despite the fact that we were pushing against a pretty heavy current, we were making pretty good time. We were going between 3 to 5 miles per hour, just depending on exactly where we were on the river. I have 2 different rudder systems right now that I'm testing on these different kayaks. One is a Select rudder system, the other one is a Smart Track rudder system. Both of them seem to work pretty much identical as far as their ability to control the boats. Personally, I prefer the feel of the Smart Track system, but as I say in my rudder course, the Select system has a lot of practical advantages that in some cases could really outweigh the difference in feel. And so if you're curious about that, I would just check out the free first half of my skin on frame rudder course. I talk about that extensively there. So anyways, we're headed upriver, things are going well, we're making good miles, and then the wind starts to die down lower and lower and just get into that really frustrating situation that you find yourself sailing in any small boat where you're just poking along at 2 miles per hour and it feels like you're going to take forever to get anywhere. So fortunately or unfortunately, kind of another crazy harebrained scheme that I had come up with right before we went on this trip is I prototyped a center sail that would attach between both the masts, basically a 1 square meter panel of Mylar. And the idea was if we got into those conditions, we could just land really quick, we could tie it in place, and then we could take off again and we could get a little bit of extra push. So that's what we did. Worked really well, actually. We were now cruising along at 3 to 4 miles per hour again, even though we only had about 8 miles per hour of wind behind us. And I thought there might be a potential safety issue there, but I assumed that if anything happened, I could just pull the whole thing back onto us. We could tie the sails up as per normal, and that flat Mylar panel would just sit flat in front of us. And so I wasn't thinking it would be any kind of serious hazard, but I was about to be proven wrong. Basically, the wind started to pick up more and more. Normally in those conditions, that's when I would have landed and taken the sail down, but this being a testing trip, I wanted to overstress the system. So as the wind started to pick up to 15 and then almost 20 miles per hour, I just left it up and we were flying along. I mean, even with 2 to 3 miles an hour of current against us in boats with a 6 mile per hour hull speed, we were doing a consistent 5 to 7 miles per hour downwind. And that's when we experienced our first big failure. Basically, all of a sudden, both the masts just folded forward and folded flat into the water. And I could not figure out what had just happened. The masts weren't broken, none of the rigging was damaged, I couldn't see any problems, but it was kind of an emergency because suddenly we've got wind pushing on us and we've got this massive scoop of water of both of the masts and also that center sail just forcing its way, plowing through the water, and you could see everything bending and it looked like everything was going to break pretty quickly. So we started back paddling like crazy to take some stress off the rig and got over to shore, and then I started looking at things and I realized what had happened is the aluminum rivets for the eye that attaches my sail stays and also my uphaul line here had sheared vertically downward. And that's something I have never seen before and not something I would have expected would have been possible, but it taught me something really important about my system, and that is, as much as I love a simple two-stay system like this, where 2 ropes basically are holding the mast forward and also holding it side to side, that just generates a tremendous amount of downward force on that eye. And I was able to effect a repair a little bit later in the day, but what we ended up doing at that point was basically just tying the sails up, and then because we didn't have any way to rig them, we held the Mylar sail between us physically and steered with the rudders. And with the amount of wind that we had, we were actually still making pretty good time, and we just kind of sailed kind of crippled like that for another couple miles until we found this tiny little island that we never would have normally camped on. I would say that the island was probably about twice the size of the room that I'm sitting in right now, but miraculously, even though it was just a rocky island, it had a flat grassy spot in the middle that was the perfect size for a tent. It was only about 2 feet above the water level, and overall it was a pretty sweet setup, although there was the possibility that the water was going to rise, but we did have ways to deal with that if that happened. So we decided to pull the kayaks up onto the island, and something I want to mention is that one of the things I'll often do when I'm beaching the catamaran with skin on frame kayaks is I'll just put a couple of sticks or logs underneath. Sometimes those can act as rollers just to kind of save wear and tear on the skin, but just having them sitting up on the sticks overnight just prevents rocks from just pushing really hard into the skin, which the skin can handle, but the less of that you do, the longer your boats are going to last. So got the boats up on the island, and then I set about trying to make a repair for our breakdown here. What I ended up doing was just unscrewing one of my deck fittings with a Leatherman and then screwing the screw directly into the sheared off hole for the eye, and then tied all the stays on with some really tight scaffold knots. And I decided to rig a back stay for the rest of our mission because as much as I really love the simplicity of the two-stay system, realizing how much downward force that it was putting on my mast partner right here just made me rethink that, and I'm probably going to end up incorporating some type of a back stay into the setup in the future. So we had a really nice night on the island. It was just beautiful. Went for a swim, watched the sunset, cooked up some dinner. Not exactly a wilderness experience just because there are trains and highways on both sides of the gorge, but if you can get past the constant noise from that stuff, it's still a pretty beautiful place to be out there. We had ospreys and also eagles flying over us at night and in the morning the next day. Woke up the next morning, really nice sunrise, made some breakfast, double checked all the rigging, and then we rolled the boats into the water and headed upriver again, this time without the Mylar sail. Really nice day in the beginning. Again, just really beautiful wind, not a lot of waves, about 12 miles per hour of wind behind us. So we're cruising along at 4 to 5 miles per hour, but the seas aren't too big and too sloppy. And we actually found another small island just a couple miles past the island that we camped on, which definitely would have been a much safer place to camp, but we didn't know that at the time. So stopped to explore that island for a few minutes, and then as we were launching, we decided to try to fly the drone to see if we could get some drone footage of the catamaran setup, which is always a bit of a stressful experience, just managing the drone and the boats at the same time and trying not to lose the drone into the water. But it turned out pretty well. Kind of shows you an idealized version of how this setup works. What you're seeing on the drone footage right now is really just as perfect as it gets for sailing conditions for this. But as we all know, if you've sailed before, perfect conditions aren't usually what you get. So later on in the day, waves got bigger, it got kind of sloppy. The kayak actually handles those conditions fine. There is a pressure wave that builds up between the hulls that puts a lot of water onto the decks when you're kind of semi-surfing down the fronts of waves. I could deal with that issue just by spreading the hulls wider apart, but I'm going to choose to keep them at this spacing just because at this spacing, one person can reach over and control all the rigging in the other person's kayak if they need to. You could very easily pass things back and forth to your paddling partner. Also, if you get into a quartering sea where the whole system racks a little bit, you can just hold on to each other's coamings, and that really helps to stabilize that racking movement or the side-to-side movement if you're going across in beam seas. And so, even though it would be nice to have these spread a little bit wider apart for performance reasons, all the practical reasons to keep them this close together outweigh those benefits. So anyways, we went through Hood River, sailed through the gauntlet of windsurfers and free foilers and kite boarders and just all the different wind-powered contraptions people have these days, which was pretty cool. Got some really interesting looks, definitely got some stoked yells from people cruising by us. Had to venture out around the sandbar there, which meant that we had to run beam to the wind for a little while. This sail system is not designed to go upwind, but considering that the sail is very, very simple right now, at least in its current incarnation, it actually sails okay on a beam reach. And I think that might increase a little bit as I start adding more and more shape to these sails. So we sailed across the wind, although not as efficiently as downwind, and then we headed onto a broad reach and picked up some speed, ended up crossing over the sandbar in about 8 to 10 inches of water, and then turned back towards shore just because the Columbia River is a really wide river, and with an untested system like this, I don't like to be too far from shore. I'm also not a big fan of hanging out in the shipping lanes. So we sailed underneath the Hood River Bridge and then just traced the shoreline, checking out various bits of abandoned industrial infrastructure and also a bunch of different native fishing platforms as well, which I think are really interesting. And then just kept cruising downwind and ended up just on a very, very long day. Wind started to die later in the day, just like it had before. Probably had about 7 or 8 hours in the cockpit that day until we finally got to somewhere where we could camp. Turned out we couldn't actually camp where we thought we could camp, and so we had to find somewhere else. And it was a little bit tricky just because that entire section of river is bounded by railroad tracks with riprap, and there's just not a lot of place to land. But found a place to land, had a really nice campsite, had a really nice night. A little bit difficult dealing with the boats. There wasn't a good place to pull them up, but I was able to just quickly unload them. And then because these are skin on frame, even with all these modifications and a heavy duty skin, both these boats only weigh 40 pounds apiece. And so we were able to just carry them up onto the rocks. And one of the things that I like about camping out of skin boats is that when you're just packing all of your stuff in a bow bag and a stern bag, when you get to where you need to go, all you've got to do is pull your foot braces back, reach forward, grab the bow bag, reach back, grab the stern bag, and it's just a really convenient way to transport all your things from the boat up to your campsite. So I just think that a lot of people tend to think that camping out of skin boats is going to be really frustrating, and it definitely can be if your boat isn't designed for it, but at least the way that I do it, it ends up working out really well. So anyways, after we got the boats unloaded, we just took some time to decompress after the long day on the water. Then we went for a short side hike / scouting mission, just looking out over the cliffs to kind of look towards where we were going to be paddling the next day. Liz took some time to go rock hunting, found some really cool agates. We saw the stern wheeler go by. Like I said before, not exactly a wilderness experience just because of the train tracks, but if you approach it with the right state of mind, it is a really beautiful place to be. That night, we had a pretty big change in weather. This was a non-forecasted change in weather. The only reason we knew it was coming is I saw that there was high wispy clouds in the sky the day before, which usually signals a weather change. Really strong gusts of wind that night. We were lucky that we had the protection that we did. It was gusting to 30 all night long. Woke up to a field of whitecaps out on the Columbia River, and definitely a lot stronger conditions than we were hoping to be in. Basically, it was forecast to be 14 gusting to 20 when we left on our trip. The forecast that morning was 17 gusting to 28, and when we got out, it ended up being a lot more than that. And so this is another one of those scenarios where if I wasn't deliberately trying to push this whole system past its limits, I would have made some different choices. One choice that I would have made is I would have put on smaller sails, which would have taken some stress off of the rigging. Another choice I might have made is just not go out in the first place. And that's actually really hard to do when you're bored and you don't want to stay somewhere an extra day. But training yourself to be comfortable with that is one of the biggest things that will keep you safe touring in a kayak or a canoe or any kind of small boat. But I felt like I had a pretty good risk assessment on the capability of the boats at this point, the capability of us working together as a team. I also understood the conditions that we were heading into, and we were right next to a highway and we had cell service. And so I figured worst case scenario, if something unexpected happens and we end up out of the boats in the water, we can swim to the highway and make a cell phone call. So because of all of those factors, we decided to launch, had a long safety conference with Liz. We talked about strategy and contingency, and we went for a scout. And it was a little bit tricky to get the boats packed because I had to pack them while they were sloshing around in the waves. But just like any camping system you interact with frequently, pretty quickly you get it dialed in. So we got the boats packed. When we launched, it was blowing about 20 miles per hour. We had about 3-foot breaking waves already and a few miles per hour of current against us. We were heading up, just hugging the shoreline as tightly as possible. We had bull sails up, which was a lot more sail area than I would normally have up in these conditions. Like I said, normally I would switch to a smaller sail or just fly one of the sails and leave the other one down. But we were clipping along, just doing great. We were just pushing at a consistent 6 miles an hour, which is hull speed for these boats, but is technically above hull speed because we were doing it into the current, which was substantial. And then we came around a corner and suddenly we went from sailing downwind in sustained 20 mile per hour winds with 30 miles per hour gusts with a couple miles per hour of current against us to sailing downwind in sustained 30 mile per hour winds with 40 mile per hour gusts and 3 to 4 miles per hour of current against us. And in those conditions, even right up against the shoreline, we were in 3-foot continuously breaking waves. About 20 feet out to our left, there was 6-foot breaking waves, and that was a pretty hectic situation. And that's where I started to see the system both performing exactly like it was supposed to and really pushing up against its limitations. And so kind of looking at the video footage here, you can see that both of the sails are twisting and flexing forward really extremely, and they're starting to spill wind. And that is exactly how the system is designed. One of the things that's extremely important about any small kayak sail is to have shock absorption designed into it. That way, if you do get hit by extreme conditions, the sails are going to be more likely to spill wind rather than put you in the water or potentially break your mast system. And so, even though it was very wet ride, it was extremely windy, we were getting water just pouring over the deck, we were able to keep things under control with the rudders. We also had the canoe paddles at the ready to take evasive maneuvers if we needed to, just to make sure we didn't accidentally broach. One problem that we ran into, though, was in the 40-mile-per-hour gusts, our sheets started to actually slip through the clam cleats. And so we would have to continually pull them back and keep recleating them off, which was a little distracting with all the other things we were trying to manage and just staying focused on going straight. Until finally it just got way too hectic and I decided that we should take one of the sails down. So we took Liz's sail down and we just kept sailing with my sail. And we didn't actually lose any speed at all, which just shows you just how massively overpowered we were. And we just kept going, kept focused, kept sailing downwind, had to turn onto a quartering path to kind of get around a point. A couple times I actually saw all the water just blow into a huge mist across the water's surface, which only happens when the wind speed hits about 45 to 50 miles per hour. So definitely a very extreme kayak sailing situation, not something I'm recommending that anyone out there ever do, and that you always make the appropriate judgments to make sure you never end up in those situations. But me being the designer, it's important for me to test these things with way too much wind and way too big of sails just to see at what point the masts are actually going to break or when other parts of the system are going to fail. So fortunately the mast didn't break. We didn't have any major failures in the system except for on that first day where we sheared off those rivets just because of the downward pressure from the two-stay sail system, but that's something that's pretty easy to address. So at that point in the trip, we felt like we'd had enough. I wanted to continue on for another 5 or 10 miles, but I felt like under the conditions and given the fact that we were still sailing on a jury-rigged mast setup here, it was probably a better idea just to call it while we had a safe place to get out. So we got out at Mayer State Park. Overall, I feel like this was a really successful testing situation. I got to see the whole setup perform in a variety of wind and wave conditions. I got to push the system well past its intended design limits. We had some nice campsites. I finally got some good drone footage of the catamaran. I identified a few things in the system that need to be changed, things that need to be fixed, so we're going to be working on that going forward. And then our next set of tests here is we're going to switch from the flat deck F1 kayaks to a pair of ridged deck LPB kayaks, which have a slightly different catamaran attachment, so we can see how different boats perform with the same system and also how different deck attachments handle the forces and the stresses of the sailing. So hopefully within about a month, I'll have another trip report for you guys talking about how all that worked out. And a couple things I want to mention before I go here is that even though we've been talking about the sailing and the catamaran as a single unit, these things do exist independently of each other as well. So as of right now, the catamaran system is already included in my skin-on-frame kayak building course. And you could either build that now and plan to use it with sails in the future, or you can just build it to have a stable but quickly and easily disassemblable platform on the water where you can be kayaking normally, and then you can quickly set up the catamaran boards and have a platform that you could use for fishing or hunting or photography or snorkeling. So it's just a really simple, versatile system that doesn't interfere with the normal solo paddling mode. And the same thing is true of the sails as well. And my hope right now is that I will have the sails system released as a mini course on the website by the end of August. But as always, I am very dedicated to testing things as thoroughly as possible before I release any system. So keep watching the website for that plan release and stay tuned to the channel here for that upcoming trip report. That should be really interesting as well. And if you're interested in following my design process more in real time, think about checking out our Instagram feed because I am constantly going into a lot of detail there, talking about all the different problems that I'm solving just as I'm working through the various systems I'm designing. So if you're interested in how things are built and the process of development, that's definitely something to consider. And I think that's pretty much it for now. So as always, thanks for watching. If you like this video, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. You can also find us on our website, capefalconkayaks.com, where I've got a bunch more skin-on-frame video courses, plan sets, and various free skin-on-frame resources. You can find us on Instagram at capefalconbuilds, where we post a daily build blog of everything we're working on here in the shop. And just like I say every time, even if you're not normally a social media person, I would really encourage you to check out the Instagram just because there is so much more cool content there than ever shows up here on the YouTube channel. All right, that's it. Take care, be safe on the water, and have fun building your skin boat.